They forced him to marry a paralyzed stranger, but he gave her a life no one ever dreamed possible. The dust kicked up by his boots had barely settled when Thomas McKinnon realized his life was about to change forever. Standing on the weathered porch of the Hartwell Ranch, he clutched the telegram that had summoned him from 3 counties away. The message was brief, cold as winter wind. Father's debts called in. Marriage arrangement finalized. Arrive immediately. Samuel Hartwell. Thomas had known this day might come. 2 years ago, when drought nearly killed his cattle and creditors circled like vultures, Samuel Hartwell had offered salvation in the form of a loan. The terms seemed reasonable then. Work the land, pay back the money, keep his freedom. But buried in that handshake deal was a clause Thomas had hoped would never surface. If he couldn't repay the full amount by the agreed date, he would marry Hartwell's daughter to settle the debt. The front door creaked open, and Samuel Hartwell emerged, a man whose weathered face told stories of hard winters and harder choices. His gray eyes held no warmth as they fixed on Thomas. "You came," he said simply. "A man honors his word," Thomas replied, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. At 28, he had imagined his wedding day might involve love, or at least choice. This felt more like a business transaction, cold and calculated. Samuel's expression softened just a fraction. "Before we proceed, there's something you need to know about Clara." He paused, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "She was thrown from a horse 3 years ago. The accident left her unable to walk. The doctors say she'll never walk again." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just an arranged marriage. It was a burden he was being asked to carry for the rest of his life. His first instinct was to mount his horse and ride back to his own failing ranch. Debt be damned. But something in Samuel's eyes stopped him. It wasn't manipulation or cold calculation. It was the desperate love of a father who feared his daughter would spend her life alone. "Where is she?" Thomas asked quietly. Samuel led him through the house, past rooms filled with the comfortable clutter of family life. Photographs lined the mantelpiece. A younger Clara on horseback, laughing at some long-forgotten joke. Her smile in those pictures was radiant, full of the kind of joy that comes from freedom and possibility. Thomas felt a pang of grief for the woman in those photographs, wondering what remained of that spirit. They found Clara in the back garden, sitting in a wooden wheelchair beneath an ancient oak tree. She was reading, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight like spun silk. When she looked up, Thomas was struck by her eyes, the same clear blue as a Montana sky, but holding depths of pain and resignation that made his chest tighten. "Clara," Samuel said gently, "this is Thomas McKinnon." She closed her book with careful precision, her movements deliberate and controlled. "The man who's going to marry me to settle father's debt." Her voice was steady, matter of fact, but Thomas caught the slight tremor underneath. She had accepted this arrangement, but acceptance and happiness were two very different things. Thomas removed his hat, unsure of the proper protocol for meeting your arranged bride. "Miss Hartwell," he said simply. Clara's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Please, Mr. McKinnon, given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with formalities. You're getting damaged goods, but at least you're getting a debt-free ranch in the bargain." The bitterness in her voice hit Thomas like a physical blow. This woman, barely 25 by his guess, had reduced herself to a transaction, a burden to be passed from father to reluctant husband. He found himself angry, though he couldn't say at whom. At Samuel for putting them both in this position? At Clara for giving up on herself? At the accident that had stolen her freedom? At himself for being too proud to walk away? "I don't see any damaged goods," Thomas said carefully. "I see a woman who's been dealt a hard hand, but that doesn't make her any less valuable." Clara's eyes flashed with something, surprise maybe, or suspicion. "Pretty words, Mr. McKinnon, but words don't change reality. You're marrying a woman who can't walk, can't work, can't even be a proper wife." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and fears. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Maybe we should talk about what we can do instead of what we can't." Over the next few days, as they prepared for a wedding neither truly wanted, Thomas began to understand the woman behind Clara's defensive walls. She had been the heart of the ranch before her accident, helping with the books, training horses, managing the household with competent grace. The paralysis hadn't taken her intelligence or her capacity for hard work, but it had stolen her confidence and sense of purpose. The wedding was a small affair, held in the parlor with only Samuel, the preacher, and two neighbors as witnesses. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to accommodate her seated position. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to surprise her, as if she had forgotten she was anything more than her limitations. Thomas wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he was making the biggest mistake of his life. When the preacher asked if he would take Clara as his wife, Thomas looked into her blue eyes and saw not resignation, but a flicker of hope she was trying desperately to hide. "I do," he said, and meant it more than he had expected to. Clara's vows were spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, but they were steady. When she said, "I do," Thomas heard not just acceptance of their arrangement, but a tentative trust that perhaps this man might be different from what she feared. The kiss that sealed their union was brief, almost formal, but Thomas felt Clara tremble slightly when his lips touched hers. It was the first crack in the armor she had built around her heart, and it gave him hope that maybe, with time and patience, they might build something real together. Their wedding night was awkward, filled with careful politeness and uncertainty. Thomas had prepared a room for himself in the ranch's bunkhouse, assuming Clara would want her privacy, but she stopped him as he gathered his things. "This is your house now, too," she said quietly. "We're married, Mr. McKinnon. We should at least try to make it look real." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "And it is real, Clara. Maybe not the way either of us planned, but it's real." She nodded, though he could see the doubt in her eyes. They settled into separate rooms connected by a door that remained firmly closed, two strangers learning to navigate the complex terrain of an unexpected marriage. The first months were difficult. Clara had built her life around limitation, creating a small, safe world she could control from her wheelchair. She handled the ranch's correspondence and bookkeeping, tasks that could be done from her desk, but she had given up on everything else. Thomas watched her watch him work with the horses, saw the longing in her eyes when he rode out to check the cattle, noticed how she turned away when he came back dusty and tired from the work she used to love. Thomas was patient, but he was also observant. He saw how Clara's face lit up when she heard the horses in the corral, noticed her unconscious expertise when she commented on their training. One evening, as he worked with a particularly stubborn colt, he made a decision that would change everything. "I could use some help," he called to Clara, who was watching from the porch. "I can't," she began automatically. "You can't walk," Thomas interrupted, not unkindly. "But your mind works just fine, and you know horses better than anyone around here. That colt's got spirit, but he's scared. You always had a way with the scared ones." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly she wheeled her chair closer to the corral. "He's not scared," she said finally. "He's angry. Someone broke his trust, probably used harsh methods. See how he keeps his ears back but doesn't actually strike? He wants to trust again, but he's waiting for proof it's safe." Thomas studied the horse with new eyes and saw she was right. "How do I show him it's safe?" What followed was the longest conversation they had shared since their wedding. Clara guided Thomas through a gentler approach, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she remembered skills she thought were lost to her. When the colt finally accepted Thomas's touch, Clara's smile was radiant, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her. That evening marked a turning point. Clara began spending more time outside, offering advice on the horses and cattle, her expertise bridging the gap between her physical limitations and her need to contribute. Thomas made sure she felt needed, asking her opinion on everything from which pastures to use to how to handle difficult animals. But the real breakthrough came 3 months into their marriage, on a day when everything went wrong at once. A storm had spooked the cattle, scattering them across 3 valleys. 2 horses had come up lame, and Thomas was facing the impossible task of gathering the herd alone before more were lost to predators or injury. Clara found him in the barn that evening, exhausted and discouraged. "You can't do this alone," she said simply. "I don't have a choice," Thomas replied, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Yes, you do. Clara's voice was different, stronger, more determined than he had heard it since their wedding. I may not be able to ride anymore, but I can still handle a wagon. I know this land better than you do, and I know where those cattle are likely to have gone. Thomas looked up, surprised. Clara, it's rough country out there. The wagon roads. I'm not made of glass, Thomas. Her blue eyes flashed with something that had been missing too long. Fire. I used to work this ranch. I know every trail, every water hole, every place cattle might shelter. You need help, and I can give it to you. The next morning they set out together, Thomas on horseback, Clara driving a sturdy wagon loaded with supplies. It was the first time she had left the immediate vicinity of the ranch house since her accident, and Thomas could see both fear and exhilaration in her face as they rode into the wilderness. Clara proved herself right about knowing the land. She guided them to hidden valleys and sheltered coves where the scattered cattle had taken refuge. More importantly, she proved herself right about not being made of glass. When the wagon got stuck in a creek crossing, she helped push it free, her arms strong from months of maneuvering her wheelchair. When they needed to camp overnight to complete the gather, she set up their simple camp with competent efficiency. That night, sitting around their small fire under a blanket of stars, something shifted between them. For the first time, they talked not as strangers bound by obligation, but as partners sharing a common purpose. I forgot how beautiful it is out here, Clara said softly, her face turned up to the star-filled sky. You belong out here, Thomas replied. I could see it in your face today. You came alive again. Clara was quiet for a moment. I thought that part of my life was over. After the accident, everyone treated me like I was broken, something to be protected and pitied. I started believing it myself. You're not broken, Thomas said firmly. Different than you were, maybe, but not broken. Today proved that. When Clara looked at him across the fire, Thomas saw something new in her eyes. Not just trust, but the beginning of something deeper. They were still sleeping in separate bedrolls, still careful not to cross certain boundaries. But the walls between them were beginning to crumble. The cattle drive was successful, but more importantly, it gave Clara back a sense of purpose and capability she had thought lost forever. Over the following weeks, she became Thomas's true partner in running the ranch. She couldn't do everything she used to do, but she found new ways to contribute, new ways to be valuable. The change in Clara was remarkable. The bitter resignation that had marked their early days together was replaced by growing confidence and joy. She laughed more, smiled more, and slowly began to believe that her life might still hold possibilities she had given up on. Thomas found himself falling in love, not with the idea of being married, but with Clara herself. He loved her quick intelligence, her dry sense of humor, her fierce determination to overcome every obstacle. He loved the way she hummed while working on the books, the way she talked to the horses as if they were old friends, the way her face lit up when she successfully managed a task others thought impossible for her. But Thomas was careful not to push too hard or too fast. Clara had been hurt by more than just her accident. She had been hurt by a world that saw her as less than whole. He was determined to prove that he saw her as completely and beautifully herself, exactly as she was. The breakthrough in their relationship came 6 months after their wedding, during the spring roundup. Clara had been working with a young mare that was proving difficult to train, not mean, but anxious and unpredictable. Most of the ranch hands had given up on her, but Clara saw potential others missed. She's not stupid or stubborn, Clara explained to Thomas one evening. She's intelligent, maybe too intelligent. She thinks too much, worries about everything. She needs to learn to trust her instincts. Thomas watched Clara work with the mare from her wheelchair, speaking in low, soothing tones, offering patient encouragement rather than force. Slowly, gradually, the horse began to respond, her anxiety giving way to cautious confidence. You're not just talking about the horse, are you? Thomas asked quietly. Clara's hands stilled on the mare's neck. No, she admitted. I suppose I'm not. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, the door between their rooms remained open. They didn't cross the threshold, not yet, but the opening itself was significant. They were learning to trust their instincts, learning that the love growing between them was real and worth the risk. Winter brought its own challenges and revelations. The harsh Montana weather kept them indoors more often, forcing them to rely on each other's company in ways they hadn't before. Clara taught Thomas to read and write better. His education had been limited by frontier necessities, while he shared stories of his travels and dreams for their future. During the long evenings by the fire, they began to truly know each other. Clara spoke of her childhood dreams, her love of literature, her desire to see the world beyond the ranch. Thomas shared his hopes of building something lasting, of creating a legacy that would outlive them both. They discovered they both loved music, both worried about the changing times, both carried secret fears about whether they were worthy of love. "I used to think I was damaged," Clara confessed one snowy night as they sat together reading. "Not just physically, but fundamentally. Like the accident had broken something essential about who I was." Thomas set down his book and moved closer to her chair. "What do you think now?" "Now I think maybe I was just waiting," she said softly. "Waiting for someone to see me as whole, to help me see myself that way again." The physical consummation of their marriage came naturally, tenderly, on a quiet February evening, when the walls between them finally crumbled completely. Clara had worried that her paralysis would make her undesirable, incapable of being a real wife. But Thomas showed her with gentle patience that love found its own way, that intimacy was about far more than what her body could or couldn't do. "I never thought anyone could love me like this," Clara whispered in the darkness afterward, her head on Thomas's shoulder. "I never thought I could love anyone like this," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "This isn't what either of us planned, but it's better than anything I could have imagined." Spring brought new life to the ranch and new challenges to test their growing bond. Clara discovered she was pregnant, news that shocked both of them and their doctor, who had warned that her condition made pregnancy unlikely and dangerous. "We don't have to," Thomas began, but Clara stopped him with a look. "This baby is a gift," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The pregnancy was difficult, filled with complications and concerns, but Clara approached it with the same determination she brought to everything else. She worked with the doctor to understand her limitations, modified her activities without giving up her involvement in ranch life, and prepared for motherhood with characteristic thoroughness. Thomas was terrified and elated in equal measure. The thought of losing Clara or their child haunted his nights, but during the day he marveled at her strength and courage. She never complained about the discomfort or acknowledged the danger, focusing instead on the miracle growing within her. Their son was born during a late spring blizzard, after a labor that tested everyone's endurance. Dr. Patterson had traveled from town despite the weather, bringing his medical bag and a lifetime of frontier experience. Clara's strength amazed them all. She endured hours of difficult labor with grit and determination, refusing to give up even when the doctor's face showed concern. When their son finally arrived, healthy and strong despite the difficulties, Thomas wept openly. Clara held their baby with shaking hands, her face radiant with exhaustion and joy. "What shall we call him?" she asked softly. Thomas looked at his wife, this woman who had overcome so much, who had taught him that strength came in forms he had never imagined, and knew immediately. "Hope," he said. "We'll call him Hope." Clara smiled through her tears. "Hope McKinnon. It's perfect." The first months of parenthood brought new challenges and deeper joy. Clara adapted to motherhood with the same creativity she brought to everything else, finding ways to care for their son despite her physical limitations. Thomas built special equipment to help her: a changing table at wheelchair height, a bassinet that could be easily moved, arrangements that allowed her to nurse and care for Hope with comfort and dignity. Word of their story began to spread throughout the territory. People came from far and wide to see the woman who couldn't walk but could gentle any horse, who had married for debt but found love, who had been told she could never be a mother but was raising a healthy, happy child. Some came out of curiosity, others seeking advice or hope for their own struggles. Clara handled the attention with grace, neither hiding from it nor seeking it out. She answered questions honestly, shared her knowledge freely, and slowly became known as someone who understood that limitation was often just another word for undiscovered possibility. Thomas built Clara a special wagon during Hope's first summer, light and maneuverable, designed to allow her to travel anywhere on the ranch she wanted to go. She used it to check fence lines, supervise cattle drives, and visit the far pastures where wildflowers bloomed. It wasn't the same as riding, but it was freedom of a different kind. "You've given me back the world," Clara told him the first day she drove the wagon to the high meadow where they had camped during their first cattle drive together. "You gave me a world worth living in," Thomas replied, watching Hope sleep peacefully in her arms. Their ranch prospered under their joint management. Clara's expertise with horses combined with Thomas's strength and determination created something greater than either could have achieved alone. They expanded their breeding program, improved their stock, and built a reputation for quality that brought buyers from across the territory. But more than their business success was the life they had built together, rich in love, strong in partnership, filled with the daily miracles of family life. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who saw nothing unusual about his mother using a wheelchair. To him, she was simply the person who read him stories, sang him lullabies, and knew everything there was to know about horses and cattle and the wide world beyond their ranch. 5 years after their arranged marriage, on a golden autumn evening, Thomas and Clara sat on their porch watching Hope play in the yard. Their son was building something elaborate with sticks and stones, his concentration complete and his imagination boundless. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met differently?" Clara asked, her hand resting comfortably in Thomas's. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but I can't imagine any other path leading us here, to this exact life, this exact happiness. Even knowing all the pain we had to go through?" "Especially knowing that," Thomas said firmly. "The pain taught us what we were worth, what we could survive, what we could build together. Without it, we might never have recognized what we had." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reflected on the strange turns life could take. He had come to this place as a reluctant groom, bound by debt to marry a woman he didn't know. He had found his other half, his partner, his heart. Clara had entered their marriage believing herself broken, damaged, suitable only for an arrangement born of necessity. She had discovered that love could redefine everything, that strength came in forms she had never imagined, that happiness was not about what you could or couldn't do, but about who you chose to do it with. Their story became legend in the territory, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. People spoke of the arranged marriage that became a great love story, of the woman who couldn't walk but could gentle any horse, of the man who saw treasure where others saw only burden. Children grew up hearing about Thomas and Clara McKinnon, about how love could transform the most impossible circumstances into something beautiful. But for Thomas and Clara themselves, it was simply their life. Sometimes difficult, always wonderful, and proof that the best things often come disguised as the challenges we think we can't handle. They had started as strangers bound by obligation and built something that would outlast them both. A love story that showed the world that limitation was just another word for opportunity in disguise. In the end, they had given each other exactly what they both needed most: the chance to become more than either had ever dreamed possible, together. The debt that brought them together had been paid long ago, but the dividends of their love would continue forever in the life they had built, the son they were raising, and the example they set for everyone who believed that broken things could never be made whole again. They were wrong about that, Thomas and Clara proved. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life were the ones that had been broken and healed, scarred and strengthened, tested by fire and emerged not just intact, but transformed into something far more precious than they had ever been before.